Hi, and welcome to the Courtenay Turner Podcast. I'm your host, Courtenay, and I'm super passionate about moving and thinking. On this show, we are going to dive into all things health, fitness, personal development, lifestyle, and political, sociocultural. I've always been fascinated by people, and I love learning from the experiences and stories of others. This has been a treat for me, and I hope this is enjoyable and useful for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or any way that I can make this a better experience for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Hello, and welcome to episode 100. Can you believe that? That's amazing, 100 episodes. I thought it called for a celebration. And I also really wanted to thank each and every one of you for being on this journey with me. It really just means so much to me. I never would have thought we'd be here with 100 episodes. It's really awesome. So I hope these conversations have informed you, inspired you, and empowered you to become a truth torch, because that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking to build an army of truth torches. I think that's what we need in order to beat, the Great Reset and preserve the free will of humanity. So as you know, I have been really censored. So anything you can do to help me beat these algorithms would be amazing. If you like this, just share it, keep commenting, liking, subscribing. And if there's anything that I can do to make this a more valuable experience, please reach out to me and let me know. What do you want to see more of? What do you want to see differently? Are there specific guests you would like? Just let me know, because I want to make this as valuable and enjoyable for each and every one of you. So thank you so much. Thanks for watching. Hello, welcome to the Courtenay Turner Podcast. I'm here today with Amy Pfeffer. She is a life coach and counselor and a sex trafficking advocate. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
And how are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Yeah.
Doing great.
Awesome. So for my audience, maybe you could tell a little bit about your story and why this is so important to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, my name is Amy Pfeffer. I grew up actually myself in the sex industry. So it was a very unique upbringing for me. And I was actually able to escape at about the age of 13 and started living with different families. And, at the age of 17, my life was just radically transformed. And I really walked a healing path all the way to where I'm actually able to advocate for sex trafficked survivors today. I've worked with sex trafficked survivors for about the past 7 years. And kind of I don't want to call it a niche, but working a lot with survivors of satanic ritualistic abuse and ritual abuse and things like that. So it's been phenomenal. It's just such rewarding work.
When you say you grew up in the sex trafficking industry, what does that mean? Like, who was doing the trafficking? Who were you interacting with?
Yeah. So I was not trafficked. There was a period of time where my younger sister was in a trafficking situation, but I grew up in the sex industry. So we were in and around the sex industry all the time. My biological mother worked in a strip club, and I lived on and off with a strip club owner. And my younger siblings and I were always in the strip clubs. I mean, that was just our life. We got to know the owners very well. We all lived with the owners and just did life with the strippers and counted stripper dollars while we were growing up. And it was quite the interesting upbringing for sure. So that's what I mean. And my cousin was actually out in the sex industry in LA as well. And unfortunately, she lost her life in 2019.
Wow, I'm sorry. How did she lose her life?
So, I mean, just the lifestyle in and of itself is dangerous, right? Being in the sex industry. I know that there were a lot of medical procedures that she had to go through. And it's my understanding that she was part of the pornographic film industry. We were the same age. So, and she lost her life in 2019. And so that's the unfortunate reality of this industry.
Right.
And I know that it's a debated topic, if it's a sex worker, if it's something that someone chooses, but in my line of work, just dealing with women who are constantly objectified, not given other opportunities in life, or many times just forced into the sex industry. It's really depraved and horrific industry for sure.
Yeah, no, I can just imagine. That's an interesting point about people choosing, because I think there are people choosing, and I think that this is just my personal belief, but I'm really curious firsthand your experience and what your beliefs are as a result of that. But I think, we have free will. We can choose good, we can choose, not so good. And that is for people to make that choice for themselves, and, they should reap the consequences of those actions. But it's a very different thing when they're forced into something that is, so devastating.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, I mean, I think that is certainly a debated topic, if people choose, and you could say, like, my biological mother chose to be in a sex industry. I remember us saying, like, could you just consider a job at McDonald's or, somewhere else? Like, we don't. And she said, it's just skin. I mean, it's just like any other industry. So it's not really, and she chose that lifestyle. She embraced that, obviously, without considering the consequences of what she was doing to her children.
Right.
However, she was, had sexual assault since before the age of 4, from my understanding, from father and siblings, brothers. So she was conditioned to believe that she was just an object to men to be used. Right. So it's like, you think that there's a choice, but when you're conditioned, it seems like more of an illusion of choice, because you've been so assaulted that you just feel like that's what you're kind of good for, which is kind of what I feel happened to my cousin as well. So that is my counterpoint to that argument, because yes, did they choose it? Sure. But they didn't really have a choice with how objectified they were and how brutally assaulted that they were, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. Wow. Yeah, I guess that brings the question of choice, right?
Yeah.
So that would be a deeper philosophical kind of context.
Right.
Yeah. Like, what is choice? What is free will? And how far does that go?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you're conditioned to make specific choices without realizing there are other choices out there,
right?
Then I think that's when you cross paths with others and you see how others live their life, and that maybe opens your eyes to a totally different passage that you had never considered before. But when you're in and around that environment and you grow up in the sex industry, there literally is no other option for you, because that's all you're presented with.
Right.
So, yeah.
Wow. What were some of the things that you said that you've worked with others who have been in the sex industry or trafficked, and that you had also done some occult ritual kind of?
Yes. Working with SRA survivors, or satanic ritualistic abuse survivors. Yeah. So that's a whole different ball game. So from what I have seen in that regard, it's where I came from is not sophisticated, tactical, doesn't have that intellectual evil. It's just depravity.
Interesting. That's a really, I feel like that's a really profound way of distinguishing the two.
That's how I feel now, working with these, SRA survivors, because they're coming from a high level of intelligent evil, where they specifically know all the Milgram studies. They're very familiar with all the psychology after World War II, when the Nazi scientists were brought over, the Hitler-Himmler research, how to hijack and hack the human design.
Right.
So how do you tap into dissociation or dissociative identity disorder? How do you fragment the personality, break down that person, and then build them up into a machine for your own good, whatever that is, right? And so that is a total other level of conditioning. So some of these individuals in my counseling office will come in fully dissociated. And what that means is, they used to call it multiple personality disorder, right? And the way people used to look at it is like the separate pies is what I call it. Like, hey, here's this personality, here's this personality, here's another personality. And the way I help my survivors to see it is, no, like, this is all one pie. It's just fragmented into several pieces. So this is all part of you, but what we're working on doing is healing each part and integrating them together into the whole person. But this programming and conditioning is incredibly evil. And a lot of times these survivors go through horrific things since infancy, sometimes even in the womb, different things that they do, whether it's, electric charges and, stimulation or things to put fear into the child. Right. So when they're born, a lot of times sexual assault begins from infancy, and it sounds horrific and unbelievable, but the fact is that it's true. And in fact, there was a survey recently done. I can't remember the name of the ministry that it was done, but 75% of these ritual abuse survivors said that their abuse was done under like Freemasonry, Elks Lodge, Eastern Star, Odd Fellows, different things like that, of 75% that happen in those circles. And so having to understand that world and then the world of the occult to kind of understand, how do I help deprogram these survivors to become who they were supposed to be from the beginning? So much damage had been done by that point, right? Yeah. But just to kind of integrate them as much as possible. So I've got a team of people that I work with that I can refer to, but it's a very niche type of counseling. Very interesting. Yeah.
Wow. I'm like, it's so incredibly, I don't know, just horrifying. Like I feel very emotional just hearing it.
Yeah.
To know that kind of evil and that kind of such specific manipulation exists. Yeah. How are they familiar with, you said that they know that it's Freemasonry and Eastern Star, like they know these occult groups and so how do they know that? Like what they, from your experience, what do they say that indicates that they know directly these groups, and what is their familiarity with the groups?
The survivors themselves?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting because obviously when the survivors are young, there's things called amnesic barriers that are programmed in. Yeah. So they don't remember a lot of the abuse that happens.
I can imagine, yeah.
So, and then they don't know to put those two together, like that it came from this specific group and this is what happened,
right?
Until much later in life. And typically, I work with teenage clients, and some of them are much older, but around the age of 30 is when a lot of them start having these flooding memories. And so when that happens, there's a lot of questions, things that they're like, wait, did this happen to me? Why am I all of a sudden having these memories that seem, it's not just dream state. Like this seems like something that happened to me. Now, when they go in to do the research, then they realize, okay, this actually did happen. I'm not insane. They can corroborate the evidence with multiple others. And then they realize, okay, there's a correlation with some of these groups and the very high level of sophistication of the abuse that is done. So, but some of the teenagers that I work with, there is some memory flooding, but they're like, I knew that my father or my grandfather was affiliated with Freemasonry, but I didn't know what that meant. And so now, you're able to kind of open the door and help them understand and facilitate healing by saying, here's kind of some Luciferian practices, or here's what they believe. And it's a totally different worldview than like your common Christian worldview if you're living in the Bible Belt of the United States of America. Right. So it's very interesting. It's amazing because sitting with some of these survivors, especially the teenagers, and you explain to them, here's what it is, here's what you're experiencing. Does this make, and just checking in with like, how are you feeling right now?
Right.
The response that I'm seeing is relief. Like, oh my gosh, I didn't understand why I was seeing this specific symbol over and over, or why I was afraid to look in the woods here, or why, this or that, or this or that. And it's like, oh my goodness, I have my answer now. And so then it's walking through the healing patterns of like, grief. Right. And like, how do you accept this, but have anger about it and seek justice, but also know that some of it is just acceptance at the end of the day. And how do you stop this from happening to the next generation? And, things like that. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I would imagine it's a huge relief just having some sort of answers, that it's not just this big cloud of overwhelm, like mystery.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. do the memories start to become more crystallized for them when you go through those connections?
Yes, in some cases, and in some cases there might still be amnesic barrier.
Right.
It's one survivor might be different than another, so you don't know what you're exactly going to get, but a lot of times it's very solidified for them. And then, if they have siblings, then you can kind of check in if the sibling is at a place where they've attained a certain amount of healing, that they can say, hey, like, I'm just starting to realize some things. Can I check in with you? Did this happen to you? And then that they can get corroboration with a sibling. So then that's even more powerful to them to be like, this is part of my story.
Right.
And I know not everybody has a Christian worldview, but for me, like, I gave my heart to the Lord when I was 17. And if I hadn't done that, my life, the trajectory would not have been what it is today. But giving people their story back is something that I feel it's very important, because, you need your story as part of your testimony. Right. To be able to then be empowered by what has happened, and then to, help others. Whereas if those amnesic barriers stay in place, there might be a part of your persona that you're not integrating in, but it's also a lack of testimony. So I feel like it's really important to have the whole of kind of what happened, but some memories are kind of, they're so horrific that you wish you could just keep tucked away.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's an element of clarity that's really helpful in general, just in life, we look for that. We're meaning making creatures. That's kind of what we do. But I think when it comes to trauma, my experience has been that, having an understanding or clarity of the trauma is not always essential. And in some cases, it's even detrimental to healing. We can heal in other ways without actually addressing the trauma itself, because sometimes it's just so horrific that revisiting it is almost like, reopening a wound. Yeah.
I mean, it's such a debated topic. Because it's like, well, there's EMDR, and what do we do? Like, that's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So it's like you're trying to recall the memory, but hit different neural pathways so that it's not causing you so much trauma. So, and then especially with my DID clients, and BPD, borderline personality disorder, is very much tied in there too. But once you learn dissociation at such a young age, you don't stop, because it's an autonomic automatic process for the person, and they automatically dissociate when they feel stress. So it's teaching coping skills to manage through stress without hiding behind your dissociation, which is so difficult. But it's a certain amount of healing that is required to be able to tap into coping skills that are more productive than maladaptive. That makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. So when you're dealing with that, I would imagine in both types of clients, there's a certain element of deprogramming that needs to occur. And, as you were talking about, like, the conditioning that happens, it happens in both, but one is probably a little bit more inverted kind of conditioning that happens as a result of somebody else's dysfunctionality. Whereas this is much more specific, targeted kind of conditioning, manipulation. So what are some of the things that are involved in deprogramming that, and how is it different for the two?
So, I think for the two, like, you mean just someone who didn't go through that and has just like trauma or anxiety or depression,
or even for, like, you're talking about people who may have been involved in, like, the sex industry as a byproduct of their family, or may even have incurred some sort of abuse and, the traumatic events, but those were a result of somebody else's choices and dysfunctions. It's not the same kind of high level, what they like, human hacking kind of a tactic that
some of the same things. Like, obviously people who are sophisticated evil are tapping into the concept of dissociation, because they've learn the human brain and just the human design so much. It's so disgusting to me because it's an entitlement that they own the human.
Yeah.
And you see that across so many levels, right?
Take major issue with it.
Yeah. I mean, political, the medical field, like all these different things, right?
And I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I have to say, you were talking about like, a Christian worldview, and I'm actually not Christian, but I don't think I have a religious view, but I don't think you need to be religious to see how evil it is to try and play the role of God, the creator, and to manipulate what it is to be human. To me, that is just so incredibly evil.
But I mean, I just don't know what has given them permission to think that they own all of humanity. It's just not appropriate. But I mean, so one survivor is coming to my mind right now where she didn't have the sophisticated level of dissociation and programming for specific things, because some of the programs are, it could be ballerina, or it could be an actress, or it could be sniper, or whatever. It's a military grade style of programming. Well, another survivor just came to mind who, she just came from a multi-generational incest-based family. And she was sold in diapers to men in her neighborhood out of a trailer. Her biological mother just sold her. And so then that was her life, right? She became conditioned to feel like she should be sold, and that's just normal. That's what, so then she was, involved in trafficking as she grew older. And I was assigned to be her advocate and mentor. And she's, in her 40s. So, and it's a new world for her to not be in that trafficking environment. And how does she then deprogram herself and then reprogram herself? There's still similarities where I might map alters. So an alternative portion of their personality, we'll try to understand, like, from an internal family systems. This is very counselor jargon right now, but a lot of times there's like a guardian. So I try to help them find the terminology for each of the different parts of themselves.
Right.
And that's similar to those who have been through SRA as well. It's just with the SRA piece, there is that purposeful amnesic barrier placed into each of these separate personas. So it's finding the separate personas, mapping them out, determining their purpose and what emotions they hold. And at the age of which the abuse occurred is the age that they are like age arrested in this part.
So they're kind of stunted. Oh, yes. And the personality is codified in.
Yes. So like you could look at, I'm sure you've heard of like MK Ultra, Project Monarch, Bluebird, like all the things, right? A lot of the celebrities, from my understanding, and of course I'm not part of that world, I just work with SRAs, I see it come in, but it does look like there's a heavy amount of that type of programming to where you can see the shifting and shaping of the different personalities that come out in some of these folks at any given time. So it's very interesting to be honed in and like keyed in on some of these things. But yeah. So does that help you understand?
No, it does. Yeah. I'm thinking that little fact about me, the CIA tried to recruit me when I was 7. And I would say I feel like my soul was spared. But now knowing what I know, I feel really, really grateful. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, I have no idea what, they wanted me for or what they were going to do, but
yes,
the possibility seemed like it might not have been so great.
Probably wouldn't have been the best experience of your life, but I'm sure they colored it in such a way that you were highly sought after.
They did.
And
my mom said they were pretty relentless. They were, they really, really tried.
Yeah.
They really tried to flatter her and convince her that it was a great idea.
So good for her. And then she fought back against it.
Yeah, she got one. She almost like hung up on them. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I'm curious. I know
your mother, the hero,
in so many ways, for sure. But I'm curious how you got into the SRA end of it. Because your personal experience, certainly you had a compassion for those who were involved in the sex industry and who were victims. And I can get that, but how they are kind of different worlds.
Yeah.
there's dysfunction in life, unfortunately. People make bad choices. That doesn't necessarily make them evil.
Right.
You know, people
Exactly.
We're fallible. We make poor choices that may seem great at the time, and we don't have the foresight to know the consequences of our actions or the consequences for others of our actions. So, so that's a very different thing. I'm not necessarily saying it's a good thing, but that happens in many different facets of just the human experience. But this is, the SRA is something, it's so specific, and it is really, it is trying to control the human experience, what it means to be human. So that feels different. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, no. So I've got a couple thoughts in my mind. I promise that we'll come together.
Okay.
But, going through school for clinical mental health counseling and just listening to the professors talk about, make sure you don't niche yourself in too hard, and this professor, I remember her talking about, she started out working with children because she just loves children. Her heart was just for children. She just wanted to scoop them up. And she's like, I had to work through my codependency. But, she found herself in a situation where a lot of these children were sexually abused, and some of them ritualistically through, multi-generational abuse. And what she ended up doing is working with pedophiles. So in the end, she said, I never would have thought that this is the area or my niche. Moving here, working with pedophiles who I greatly disdained and would prefer to just have them off the planet. But here I am working and listening to their pain and walking with them and helping them to heal. Wow. That's always stuck with me. Yeah. And then, because I came from such a horrific background, and I've been on my own since, I've started living with different families at the age of 13, but essentially my whole life I had been alone, right? So much abuse and so much, that there was an innate, probably codependent desire for me to rescue other things and people, right? So when my husband and I got married, we spent the first few years of our marriage rescuing dogs. So it was we had 65 dogs that we rescued and rehabilitated, and some of them were professionally fought. I don't know if you say professionally fought with dogs, but there was a pit bull, rescue that we had, and she had been torn up from fighting in the ring. And I just did everything I could. Well, I'd be walking along the park, and there'd be a little puppy that would jump out of the bushes in front of me, filled with ticks, fleas, and worms. And I'm where's the owner of this dog? Nobody's here. It's just and I know you said I'm not a religious, but I'm it's just God popped this dog in front of us, knowing that we would take care of it. Yeah. I would be driving downtown Nashville, East Nashville, and there was a little emaciated dog that just ran out in front of the car, almost got hit. I stopped, it ran right to me, and I knew it was going to die if I didn't pick it up. So I picked it up, so it's just that kind of thing that I was trained, because we had a trainer come in and train us humans as to how to take care of these dogs that had been abused. So I feel that, and I'm not correlating humans to dogs, but I'm just saying, when you get trained in something, it's my personal belief that God will use your training to its fullest. He's not going to let that go to waste. And so for me, my training are my clients. I know the term snowflake is weird in a political sense, but I feel each client that sits before me is like a snowflake, or it's like a fingerprint. They're all so unique. Nobody is the same. Right. And so I have an SRA survivor that sits in front of me. I had done so much research with dissociation, borderline personality disorder, trauma, abuse, multi-generational incest. I had done so much research knowing my background that here I was, didn't feel like I was fit to serve an SRA survivor, but so much of it was translational that I could use all of my experience personally, plus professional, all of my research and evaluation, and serve this client in front of me who is then teaching me, right? Because I'm doing the research to figure out what is the best way to serve this person. Right. So then all of a sudden, each client would share, my father was a 32nd degree Mason. Here's what happened. Hey, this happened over here. I get another SRA survivor. Oh, they want me to work with this daughter over here from a different couple. And I'm just oh my goodness, this is such an underserved community. Sex trafficking in general is an incredibly underserved community. But then you have SRA, and these are survivors. And it's a horrific type of abuse that most people even pastors don't want to touch it. Right. So when I'm this little, lowly counselor, I'm ready to take whatever God puts in front of me. And I feel like what he's put in front of me are SRA survivors right now. It's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is amazing. And yeah, thank you for the work that you're doing. It is amazing. So you said many people don't want to touch it. And I think, I come across that a lot. I don't have your, personal experience. I haven't even spoken to very many. So, but I've done a lot of research, mostly because I'm trying to figure out what's going on in the world, and it does kind of, interestingly enough, look like the Bible is kind of playing out. So, I've done just a lot of deep dives. I was a philosophy major, so I was really interested in like the philosophical roots of a lot of things. And certainly when you dive into philosophical roots of Marxism, you can't escape the satanic roots. I mean, he wrote odes to Satan.
Right.
So
there's that.
So, it was he was a plagiarist as well, but there's that too.
And he's got a long resume.
He's got a very long resume. He plagiarized from a lot of these, like, Blavatsky, these occultists, the, Weishaupt. And so when you start diving through this, so it's just, from my perspective, when you start diving into that, but what I try to expose, at least, if nothing else intellectually, some of these philosophical genesis, and to see where it's stemming from and where the origin stories. And what I hear from so many people is they just shut down. They don't want to believe these secret societies exist, and that if they do, they're inconsequential. They're really just fraternities and doing good things. I hear this all the time, and people just are so adamant about trying to shut me down and discredit me and discredit my sources as well. And I do pretty deep research. I'm not somebody who, I will make mistakes. I will certainly be wrong, and I try not to be, but it's going to happen. It has happened, and I will own it if it's proven that I'm wrong. But if I have a theory on something, I'll say, like, this is my theory. I can't prove it, but my gut instinct is telling me this, and so I'm seeing some things that point that direction. But I'm sorry, it's so long-winded, but it's so overwhelming how much I get this complete shutdown. It doesn't exist. This is just crazy conspiracy theories, right? So I'm wondering, from your experience and your perspective, if you can shine a little bit of light, as much of an oxymoron that may be, on some of these entities that do exist, and what evidence there is that they're maybe not as well intended as people would like to believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with knowledge, right? And I know I've spoken with like Kathy O'Brien and things like that. That's her big thing, is like, knowledge is our first step against mind control. People would love for us to stay in the world of the stigmatizing label of conspiracy theorists, right? Because it's the CIA coined term, right? And it brings a lot of
1035-960. Yeah.
What is that?
That was the document to avert any intention into the Warren Commission. And they weaponized the term conspiracy theorist in that. So it was kind of like the coin to label people, so that anybody who was questioning, what happened to JFK, just a crazy conspiracy theorist.
That was amazing that you just pulled that number out there. That's amazing. But yeah, I mean, it's so stigmatizing, and you're labeling this entire group of people. So culturally, everyone, and with the Milgram studies, like, people are hardwired for obedience. And so they see this group getting labeled over here. They're going to do whatever they can to stay away from that. That hides the truth. And so actually what I've learned in the past couple of years, if you see the term conspiracy theory, you probably should walk straight towards it. So that's the first thing, is really just, I don't even know if I want to tell people to research the occult. Do you know what I mean? Because it's such an ugly world.
But I will just say really quickly this, that, the interesting thing about that is that I agree with you. It's so dark. It's so ugly. You don't want to dive too deep into it, because I do think there is something to be said for just the energetic, immersement, and for lack of a better way of putting it, and that can be difficult.
Yeah.
And in some ways, some cases, possibly dangerous for people.
Yeah.
But I think there is also the juxtaposition of, to understand real light and goodness, really seeing and acknowledging the true evil that exists. I do think that there is benefit in that, that so understanding how dark it can be, it gives you kind of a sense for how much light there could be to combat it. It only takes one candle to drown out the darkness.
It's amazing. I'm hearing you talk and you're like, I don't have a Christian worldview, but that's exactly the Christian worldview, right? It is, understanding the tactics of your enemy.
Yeah.
And what do they want? Well, they want to steal, kill, and destroy. I mean, that's what Satan Lucifer wants, right? And these people, that's who they're worshiping. So when you really understand that type of depravity and the total inversion of intellect, so when they're saying God, like the light bearer, like all these things, they're talking about Satan.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean from their agenda perspective? So Walter Veith, he's a professor from South Africa. I would highly recond for people to research
He's phenomenal.
Him.
And, for anybody with an analytical mind who has any kind of doubts or, has their trouble wrapping their head around it, he really maps it out and it's very linear.
Yeah. So, and it's wonderful because he's also like, I'm going to share this with you. It's a specific quote. I'm not making this is not my own, but don't dive into this on your own. Like stay away from it. It's really horrible, but here, I'm going to give you this information. So it's enough for the average person to intellectually start understanding, okay, so this is the game. Yeah. This is the game. And so we need to understand there's that concept of duality, right? And like, look at philanthropically what I'm doing with this hand, but the evil that I'm doing with this hand, I've got behind my back so you can't see it. Just like Rockefeller and, how he philanthropically totally renovated his public persona, right? Yeah. How did he do that? But did he just get rid of the evil that he was prior to that point? No, he didn't. So like, let's do our research.
Like Gates right now. Yeah.
Yeah. But also for me, having the humans with skin on in front of me who have been abused by this, that is what has opened my eyes. So I'm not saying everybody should go out there and find an SRA survivor, but it is, if, and I of course have a Christian worldview, if the Lord puts someone before you, it is good for you to be wise to what's happening out there. And at least have some level of intellect around it. Another thing I would say is like the Georgia Guidestones. If you guys don't know what that is, like kind of take a look at that. We might visit at some point in time, but that center in between the two slabs of granite, I can't remember the name of the city. Do you remember the name of the city in Georgia? Yeah. But it's like the granite kingdom of the world. Yeah. It's pointing directly at Polaris, that center in between those two granite stones. Which is very interesting because Polaris never moves. I could go into totally different things right now, but I won't. But just seeing that number one commandment as a mockery of the Bible, and the number one commandment on these two stones in the Georgia Guidestone is to reduce the world population below 500 million. Yeah. So it's like, we're looking at some of the things that could actually make that a reality right now. Yeah. And so being keenly aware of that we actually do have an enemy, but it's a pretty enemy. And they've spent $4 billion to make it look really good in marketing. Like, we really need to be aware. I understand why some of my friends would go down the propaganda rabbit hole and think that the specific portions of the government are like on their side, but it's like, we really just need to do our research to be self-protective as well.
Yeah. And I think discernment plays such a key role, because I always say that they have a trinity that they worship. It's the triple D's, and it's deception, division, and destruction. Wow. So, right. They deceive, they distort. Yeah. That's one of their key tools. And then they divide so they can conquer. Divide and conquer is much easier to have your enemies fighting each other than it is to try and destroy your enemy. Let them destroy each other. And then destruction. I mean, they want to destroy, the world as it is, so that they can breed chaos, which is a breeding ground for usurpation, and that's the way they can seize control. So,
well, I think that's what people have such a hard time believing, right? Because we see these people on the news, and you think, oh, if they've had a really secure upbringing, where they feel secure attachment with their primary caregivers, they look at the news and they just think, hey, these people are an extension of my family. When in reality, they're just ready to take you out, and people don't want to believe that. The cognitive dissonance is way too strong, and it stops people from seeing the truth in a lot of ways.
And so speaking of the deception, like when you're talking about how we're facing some of the things that may make those Georgia Guidestones become a reality. Unfortunately, we know how they manipulate language, and they even with their tactics, it's very deceptive. I actually had a conversation with somebody today because we were talking about the document 2000. Now, to be fair, the Global 2000 document, I have not read it. I'm going to read it today. It's 66 pages. I may do a live stream on it. So
66 pages.
It's 66 pages. So it's not one of the super long white papers. Some of those white papers are really long, like hundreds of pages. So this is one of the shorter ones, but relatively speaking. But they were saying that it's not limiting growth. There's the Club of Rome document, limits of growth. They were arguing limiting growth is not genocide or mass killing people. So now, to me, that is kind of that's a deceptive paradigm, because and this, again, it's just my perspective, my worldview, but I'm curious your thoughts on this. But I believe that, it's not for us to determine what the limitations of humanity should be. So to limit it in any regard is a form, it may be a form of, it's just another iteration of the same execution of the same intent, which is to reduce the population. So whether you do it all at once in, the form of war or injections or, whatever you do, right? There are many ways of doing that, but, to slowly limit and reduce, which we know that was part of the eugenics plan with infertility and birth control. I mean, we have documentation on that. That's not me saying something that doesn't have confirmation. So I don't know. I'm curious, like, your thoughts on that. I mean, that's just one example that came to mind because I had that discussion this morning. But I think they're very deceptive in kind of their terminology, and so then people just want to discredit you because they're like, well, no, it's this and not this.
Right. Well, I think, and I've thought about that too, the governor on the human mind, and what they say we can do. I saw a documentary recently called The College Conspiracy. Have you heard of it?
No.
It's very interesting because it's like, here's how we came up with this model. It's a business model for college. What happened to apprenticeships and real, different things where you can just, you don't need all this schooling. You can jump right in and do this. You really don't.
Learn by doing.
And just because you have a degree statistically doesn't mean that you're going to get the position you want or that you'll be successful with it. So, but they came up with this, model of education that kind of tells you this is the path, right? So your path is incredibly limited. The governor is so low, it's like if you had a 100-mile-an-hour car and you put the governor at like 3 miles per hour, and that's all you ever thought you could go. That's essentially what's happening with the human mind.
And in Latin, government is control the mind. So go on,
I mean, so I just really think, what would we be? And we may not know and I understand this is like a Christian worldview thing too, but I just feel like, we may not know until the New Jerusalem is here, because we are so limited and controlled by design. And so that's not just from a eugenics standpoint that you were talking about. Like, yes, they're trying to wipe people out, so that they can take advantage of, the richness of the land or whatever it is that they ultimately want, power and then resources. But also, how are they going to control the goyim, the cattle, the us, the people that they don't really respect because we're not really as intellectual as they'd like us to be. I think they're making a huge mistake. And I wrote a song, it just came out. It's on iTunes called The Great Awakening. And recorded it in February. It came out on February 11th,
and where can they find that?
On iTunes.
Yay.
So check it out. But it talks about, the lyrics are, it was the greatest deception. The war was on my very mind. I never thought it could happen, but now we're running out of time. I see all the games that you're playing, rules for thee, but not for me. So I'll unplug from your matrix because you become so obsolete. It's just exactly, that was my like culmination of like, what is happening today?
Right. Wow.
And they meant it for the Great Deception, but the Great Awakening is happening.
Yes.
And people's eyes are being opened, and it's freaking phenomenal to look at and to see what's happening, you know, regardless of Christian worldview, regardless of what worldview you have, regardless of whether you've been injected, regardless of whether you've not, regardless of whether you wear a mask or not, or, you know, what your worldview is, people are locking arms and they're seeing what is happening. That is just horrific. And we can beat this, like we can fight this, but it has to be together.
Yes.
And it has to be without the
take away the division.
Yes. But how do we do that? Like they are putting these pre-packaged, manufactured worldviews in our TVs, on our social media, every program for a reason. Yes. It's programming. It's mind control conditioning, you know, and how do we beat that? We've got to unplug. And we have to look at each other as these walking miracles. Yes. And like, I can help you, you can help me. Like we can do this together, regardless of worldview, but they're training us and teaching us that we can't. Yeah. They're telling us we have to be divided by race or gender pronouns or this or that, you know, and it's like, no, we don't.
No, we don't. And it's so antithetical to being human, because being human, we have free will. Part of free will is freedom of consciousness. So regardless of whether, you know, my worldview or your worldview is right, we ultimately won't know. That doesn't mean there isn't truth, right? Our journey is to keep exploring, to discover truth, you know, but we have freedom of consciousness. So it's not for me to just blindly absorb any kind of, you know, doctrine that's been put in front of me. I get to go through this life and question everything so that I can formulate my own thoughts, opinions, behaviors. And that makes me. That's why I'm an individual. But they want to strip us of that so that we're lumped into all of these different groups. And by putting us into different groups, it actually dehumanizes us.
100%.
Because it puts the group above the individual. The individual is what makes us human.
Yes. And that's what I was trying to figure out, because I'm not a political person. Like I've always hated politics. You know, I always thought Hollywood were like these pretty, you know, folks or whatever, but, and then the politicians were just like Hollywood, but not as pretty, right? That's how I kind of felt.
From that.
And it was a game to me. And I still feel like there are so many gimmicks and games and just, and Veith talks about this too. It's the thesis, antithesis,
Hegelian dialectic,
synthesis. You know, it's like they're pushing one way really hard. They profit so much off of war. And it's like, this is a war of the mind. They're attacking the very mind that you own. And so, you know, push one way, then the other side comes in, no, push the other way. Well, now we've moved the dial to where the people with the agendas wanted us to move in the first place. It's just incredibly painful for the rest of us. So we could just like unplug from this and come together in our collective humanity. I mean, how amazing would that be?
So amazing.
But we've got to unplug. We have to
unplug from the matrix.
Yes.
So when you're talking about the deception, I wanted to go to something we were talking about before we started filming, but you had said that you experienced that some of these trafficking rescue, quote unquote, organizations were really deceptive. They weren't really doing the good that they purported to be doing.
Well, you have to look at who they're affiliated with. And then you also have to look at, have these affiliations had any ties to trafficking themselves? Could these survivors have been re-trafficked through the same organizations purporting to defend survivors? It's that concept of duality. It's the look at me, I'm working as an advocate. Same thing for me. Like I would love for everybody to just question me. Like, is my intention good? Am I being truthful and legitimate? You know, but everyone you have to question, just like you said, question everything. Question everyone. If someone says, I work in this great organization aimed at stopping sex trafficking, question that. You know, and I hate to say that. I wish that we were all just so honest and pure and true. But the fact is, that's not fact. So we've got to be very careful. We do have to continue to question everything.
So from that, I absolutely agree. And that's a hard thing for people to do, because it's some people, I think, just don't want to see, as we talked about before, they don't want to see the evil that exists, even though it is a reality. And I think the other thing too is that people are they're busy and they're lazy. You know, it takes a lot to really, and we're limited, so we can't investigate everything.
Right.
You know, so there has to be some presuppositions that we, will accept in order to move forward. That's just a reality of, again, being human.
Yeah.
And the confines that we encounter. So, yeah. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, so this term controlled opposition has been thrown around a lot lately, and it's become kind of a bone of contention for me, because I think people are not great at dealing with nuances. And so people get very trapped in binary logic. There's good, there's bad. Yeah. Which is typically, when dealing with humans, that's really not the case. Now, I do think there are people who are more good than bad, or do more good than harm. And there are people who, have shown to do more harm than good. But, at every moment we get to choose, and, we're very complex beings. Yeah. So it's not so easy to just say, oh, that's a bad person, and everything they do is going to be bad, because a broken clock is right twice a day. Yeah. So it's just, you can't make these blanket statements. And I think the same goes for even people who may have had affiliation or experience, or even been raised in some of these, for lack of a better word, just, satanic kind of worldviews, and being affiliated with some of these groups. But even they can choose, well, this has been what I've been, entrenched in. I may have even had severe kind of conditioning that makes me unable to see framework outside of that. But I want to do as much good as I possibly can, if anything, maybe even for their own healing. Yeah. So how do we, and this is a really kind of difficult question. I don't, sorry, it's so long-winded, but how do we distinguish between that? Right? Because I think people, because I think people want to, again, lump people into groups, right? So, well, they're affiliated with that, and so they're evil. And sometimes that's true, right? I think that, that may be true. But it's not always going to be true. And I think there are people who have been even, in some of these groups that you have mentioned, and who may genuinely be trying to do whatever good they can. It doesn't mean everything they do will be, and it doesn't mean that they aren't being controlled to some degree. Right. That's why I say the term is very, it is a nuanced thing, because there are people who are willfully controlled opposition. They know that they're being used as a pawn, and they are part of the quote unquote plan, and they go along with it. And then there are people who are unwittingly a part of it. They've been exploited. And that doesn't mean that they're not doing harm. They may be doing harm, but I have more compassion for that, because they're not evildoers. Right. Yeah.
So I've got a few thoughts on that. Right. And of course, it's always got like the counseling kind of lens on it. But I think of like borderline personality disorder, right? And you've heard the term mass formation psychosis.
Of course,
Yeah. And we really have been pushed to the brink of mental illness as a large society. Yeah. Borderline specifically struggles with elevating a person one moment and devaluing them the next.
The splitting.
Yes. And, it's black or white, all or nothing thinking. They don't have that dichotomous thinking to where you can hold multiple things in your hands at the same time. Like, this could be true. This couldn't, maybe that's true here, but just, really being pliable with your tolerance of what could be. Yeah. And these prepackaged manufactured worldviews that we have propagated to us totally wipe that out. So it's almost like we're in this microwave of like all these, only black and white, right? All or nothing. Yeah. And we're conditioned that way now. Yeah. I mean, through COVID, this has been some of the hardest hitting propaganda that has manufactured so many mentalities. For sure. That how do we then have a normal conversation with someone? And you're talking about like somebody who may have done something evil, but then didn't know that they were doing something evil or whatever. And
I'm also talking about people who may have affiliation with some of these groups, right? Like, I don't think everybody is, you can be a part of something and then still have a recognition that, oh, wow, this was not good. And and you may even still be entrenched in it and decide, I want to do whatever good I can. Yeah.
Well, similar to like the Milgram studies, when they found out, I mean, statistically, humans are hardwired for obedience.
Right.
So you could literally be on the other side of this electromagnetic pulse or whatever it was that could just fry the guy next to you. And the person holding, the expert holding the little, with the lab coat on and the piece of paper, keep going, please. And most of the time they're going to keep going. They're going to keep going. So it's like, how have we as a society become so ingrained that we have to trust whoever calls themselves an expert?
Right.
And who's propagating that this individual is the expert?
Right.
We've got to question that.
Yeah.
And really, if somebody's being called an expert on our mainstream news outlets, they're not. These are puppets that are being directed to work with a specific agenda and make us follow that specific agenda. And like pawns, we're just following into their game.
Yeah.
So I feel like we need to go back to the Hitler-Himmler research. We need to go back and familiarize ourselves with what has happened in Nazi Germany. Refamiliarize ourselves, because history repeats itself and it's doing it right now. And we're just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. Really? We can believe it. It happened before, and we're taking part in it if we don't do our research.
They perfected the playbook.
Yes, perfected on a mass scale. And it's so incredibly dangerous. But yeah, I mean, that's really the only way, is to familiarize yourself with these types of information, see what history has taught us, and try to do the exact opposite. We are the experts. We don't have to defer to anyone who's telling us to move a specific way on the chessboard. We can come up with our own future without the prepackaged manufactured worldviews that they're trying to give us.
Yeah, we can even go find a different chessboard.
Yeah, right. Brand new game.
Play a new game. I'm a big proponent of that, because I think that that's a lot of how they trap us, is to pull you into playing their game, and so then you're always on the defense.
Yeah.
And you have nothing. You have no way to move forward, because you're always on defense. So I think playing a new game is a really great, you said unplug. So I think that's the one way that we can step out of the game that they're trying to trap us in.
100%.
So really interesting. I think that's it's a really a difficult thing for people to tease out, because people don't have discernment, and mostly because critical thinking has been bred out of them because they've been spoon-fed for so long. So I think that people when you talk about the borderline personality, it's really fascinating to me, because it was maybe 10, 15 years ago, I had this theory that I was seeing an uptick in borderline personality disorder. And I really had the theory that was by design, that they were creating borderline narcissistic personalities. And I think now, knowing what I know, I mean, I didn't know a fraction of what I knew, know now then. So I didn't have the framework to contextualize it. But knowing what I know about the enemy, we'll just call them that, worldview, it is very narcissistic. They do not come from a framework of, wanting us to be human, love thy neighbor, right? That's really, I think it just can be simplified to that, love thy neighbor. It's really about self first. And putting self above all. And that is, as we see with, outside of this framework, but just from a counseling perspective, we see narcissists are, as much as they put on the front of being, this very puffed up, inflated ego, they're very depressed, and, they feel very empty. It's a very unhappy existence. And that is mostly the cover for that. And it's because you don't have the purpose. You're not on the journey, right?
Well, and it's because you lack that dichotomous thinking, the capability to look at your neighbor and try to understand what the struggle is inside of them, and knowing mostly everybody, unless they're coming with that total evil agenda where they're trying to deceive, so many, right? But the typical average human that is very bold on the opposing side of whatever your worldview is, and they're coming out hard, right? They're devaluing you. If we could just see the humanity inside of that person, as hard as it is, right? Because you understand look at what they've been through.
Yes.
Like, look at what brought them to this state, borderline personality. And I've got a lot of clients with that. It is a fragmented emotional injury disorder.
Yeah.
And I don't even like the term borderline personality disorder anymore.
Right.
I think it's like dyslimbia or something I would prefer to use, because it stems from emotional injury, where you feel like you're conditioned a certain way to appease the abuser, and it fragments the personality. And so if you can see, this is a person with a severely dismembered heart.
Yeah.
Because they've been through hell, right? And how can we see that in each other? Well, we can't if we're turning on the TV with a prepackaged manufactured worldview.
Right.
So it really stops us from experiencing all of humanity.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. When you talk about like certain organizations, because I do want people to do research with this, because I think we see so many fronts and we are being deceived on so many angles. And, you know, I've definitely been a victim of being like the really trusting person who thinks everybody just wants to do good. And it's unfortunately not turned out to be the case. So how, do you have any tips for people exploring some organizations? I mean, since you have experience with the trafficking one, that might be one to start with, just with your experience. But I think it's true for a lot of, I think it can probably be, you know, replicated for whatever people's cause is. There are a lot of times where people start these charities, there's these foundations, and they really are doing the opposite of what they purport to do. How do people investigate that?
Yeah, I would always see who they're affiliating with, like which other organizations and foundations are they receiving donations from, or, you know, financially backed by. And then you just have to do all your research there.
But those are great tangible, because you had said that before, like who they're affiliated with. But I love this, like, look at where the money is coming from. That's a huge one. You can always follow the money, and it will usually unveil quite a few things. So.
Yes, absolutely. And then, you know, I mean, you can look at the logos. You can, if you're familiar with Walter Veith and you know, do you know what I mean? Like you can see
the semiotics.
Yeah. And I hate to say that, because some of them may not know. Right. And so then you have to be careful with like what you're, you know, but, you know, check out their board, you know, make sure that you understand where they're coming from and the affiliations there. So just being very cautious in that way, because obviously the biggest thing that you don't want is for survivors to be re-traumatized or re-trafficked or just abused, you know, continuing to be abused. These people are so easily misled and manipulated, and that's how they were conditioned. So that can be preyed upon, and we have to be cautious with that in this industry, working with sex trafficked survivors.
Wow, for sure. Yeah. We definitely don't want them to be re-victimized, and we certainly don't want them to be a tool to victimize others. Yeah. So that's exactly. I can definitely see how that could happen. That's really devastating. What are some of the things that for deprogramming that, I mean, obviously this is extensive and it will vary for each person. But I think it might be helpful for, you know, just the lay person to hear key things that they can see in somebody who may have been abused, trafficked, or, you know, in that kind of a world and that kind of conditioning. And what are some things that would be really helpful to deprogram them?
Yeah, I think, you know, for some of the survivors that I've worked with, if they don't have their own identification, like if they are led by someone and their heads down, you know, they may have bruises, they may not be able to make eye contact. You may see them, and it depends, right? Because there's different tiers of trafficking. There's just like rural trafficking. There's families who have sold their children to a trafficker out of state, and now that you know, so you have to be very aware of that, just the tiers of trafficking. And then there's like the government type, you know, style elite trafficking and, you know, programming. So it's different tiers. And, but yeah, they'll give different signs. And a lot of the survivors I've worked with, they don't have any form of identification. They don't have a birth certificate. They don't have a license. So traffickers have taken that from them. If they've run away or something, you will see that they don't have any sort of identification.
Wow.
If somebody else, sometimes it's in like abortion clinics or things like that, where they come to the abortion clinic and it seems like the person that they're with, male typically, is a little more irate or short-tempered and is treating the individual like, less than human. That is a possibility that they could be trafficked. And just watching them closely, there's been a couple times, in the greater Nashville area that I've walked around and I've seen something that didn't look quite right.
Right.
So if you see something, you want to do something. Yeah, because there's different trafficking hotlines that you can call, different organizations. I've worked with where there's the intake coordinator or whatever that I'll call and I'll say, hey, this person wants to speak with them. So the survivor can actually go in and speak with them. And then they could triage whether or not they can help the survivor through the program.
Wow.
So, I think that's, there's just so many different things, but as far as I know, you mentioned deprogramming, a lot of it is altar work. It is working on the different parts of them, trying to understand when it was age arrested. If they're having flooding, help them write down the memories, kind of sit on it for a while. And a lot of it, in counseling, it's talk therapy, but I like to experientially walk them through different things as well. With whether it's a variation of empty chair technique or, getting ingrained, really helping them understand who this part of themselves is, why they've split off at that specific point in time, and what memories are retained within this part, if anything. And sometimes, sometimes they won't remember and it'll be much later that they'll remember, but then being there in the counseling setting to help them process through and sometimes feel, and there's like abreactions or different things that they'll have where they can feel the physical pain in their body again. And sometimes they have to go through and experience that. And so you're there just to help them process that painful memory and walk through the pain instead of dissociating away from it. So knowing that they can increase their distress tolerance too is super powerful for them, to stop them from automatically switching into a different side of their personality, as a defense mechanism.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I can definitely imagine helping them to shift what kind of coping mechanisms they use.
Yeah.
To help.
And another resource that's been super helpful, Kay Tolman, I don't know if you've heard of Kay, but Revelation Gateway Ministries has been very helpful. Most people will be like, oh my goodness. But she publishes like the SRA calendar. So like the Satanic ritual calendar. So you can see specific dates where these individuals may have pain that they're struggling with. And sometimes physical reactions do happen to the survivors. So Nathan Reynolds is one that came out, and his story, was, very intriguing and horrific. But his body, he would actually on specific dates during the year, because that's the Satanic calendar, there were rituals that were performed each time during that year since he was little. So sometimes this is very graphic, but it would get around that certain time of year and he would start peeing blood, or different things would happen. And so you just have to be familiar with that. So from a deprogramming standpoint, helping them to walk through those dates, reclaiming and redeeming that for them, and then just helping them grieve the pain. Because in a lot of these, SR, I won't go into any more graphic detail, but there's a lot of things that happen that are horrifically traumatic that they may have to process through for healing.
Yeah, for sure. Wow. I'm curious if I know this would be like kind of a longer winded, but it might be for, just for the audience, kind of a brief overview of what, and I know it varies for some of the occultists, they have obviously different rituals and different, but there is kind of a general world view, right? So I think that might be helpful just to hear that and how that is different from, a more traditional worldview, because I think so many people have a hard time believing that this exists. But if they were able to conceive of the notion of just an alternative worldview, that's more plausible for some, maybe.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, one of the things that I learned that I thought was interesting as far as worldview, like, in these Masonic lodges and temples and things like that, there's a platform kind of at the top, and Walter Veith goes into this as well. where they've got a Bible and they've got a Quran and they've got different, symbols, including the square and compass that looks like, oh, they're a Christian organization or, this kind of organization. These are simply symbols.
Right.
And once you get up to a certain degree, you recognize, okay, like 30 and above, for the Scottish Free Rite of Masonry, you understand that they know it is Luciferian practice and it is Luciferian worship. They don't understand that sometimes, and I would say the majority of times, below that point.
Sure.
So once they get there, they recognize they literally worship Satan. So it's the inverse. If you have a Christian worldview, it's the inverse. So you recognize darkness was actually better than light. And Satan is better than God, but they can use the terms from the Christian scriptures or from the Quran or whatever, to still honor Lucifer. So they might say the name of Jesus when really meaning Lucifer. They might, does that make sense? So I know that sounds horrific, but that is essentially what it is. It's the total inverse of Christianity. Lucifer is the one who came and cared for humanity by being the serpent and saying, did God really say that? You need to question God. And so God is really the evil one. Satan or Lucifer is really the one who illuminated the human mind.
Hence the name.
Yes. And so before God spoke and created light, it was better to be in the dark because he's the one who's spoken into light. So it's a complete hatred and abomination for anything that has to do with Jesus Christ.
Wow.
But could still use the term Jesus while really meaning Lucifer. So it's very, very interesting. Something that, I had to do a lot of research on to understand, especially in my work with the survivors, like I just don't understand how this could possibly be. But I think for me, I had a leg up on some people in the cognitive dissonance arena because my family was not one that was loving. It was not, they would present themselves as that way to the external world,
right?
But you don't exploit your children, right? You don't force your children to be in a strip club environment and to be around predators. I mean, my sisters and I were all sexually assaulted before the age of 5. So it's just, you don't do that to your children, but because it was so broken, it's like, I could look back at my family experience and have compassion and empathy towards them because that's where they were.
And that's what they were coming from.
Yes. And that's what they came from. That's how they were conditioned. Yeah. And I just so happened to understand that, they didn't have my best interest in mind. And so I feel like with kind of what's going on in our culture and how sex trafficking is just the hugest criminal enterprise, making multi-billions above, and
apparently the United States is the largest exporter, right?
It's huge.
Yeah.
And why is that? Because we don't respect human life. We don't value and have dignity for human life. We exploit it for our own purposes. And, because I saw that evil growing up, because that's where I came from, I'm now able to kind of step into it with an open mind.
You're able to see where the light could be because you saw the dark.
Yes. And that's why, again, not everybody comes from a Christian worldview, but my life has literally been transformed. So I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, Jesus Christ is the reason why I'm here and able to contribute so much to these survivors. And again, I'm respectful towards any worldview, because I fully know, just getting to know the heart of another human, you can understand where they're coming from. I just feel like we need a lot more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm so curious when you're talking to these survivors, particularly the ones who have been, the SFRA ones, but maybe even the others, but the SRA ones, do they have that worldview? What is their worldview, and has that been inculcated to them? And
that's the thing in the world of SRA, if anybody's done any research, there is a Christian persona. It's called Janus or Janus programming. So you could literally, it's Janus is that god with the one head facing this way and the other head facing this way.
I've seen the symbols that are very,
it's like one's looking in the past,
yeah.
one is looking in the future, one represents good, one represents evil. And so a lot of times the SRA victims are programmed with a good Christian part. And so sometimes in the middle of a session, I will be asking the survivor, are you fully present with me right now? Is the core of you here? Do I have permission to call all parts of you forward right now? And can they all hear me? And then we will walk through that together. It sounds crazy, but it is what needs to occur. And one part may have that Christian programming that's not legitimate. So, and then we've got to work through, what does that look like? Is there any other parts of that person that is stopping the truth from getting in? Do any of these, and do they want to have the whole of them submitted to an intelligent designer? Do they want that? Right. You know, and we've got to be respectful to them, because they've been so easily misled and obviously conditioned, and we don't want to take advantage if they're lacking critical thinking skills right now. So we want to give them the ability to say, yes, I want that, or no, I don't want that. And to recognize, is this Christian part of me fake? Is this just an overlay so that I can fit into whatever culture I've been programmed to be in?
Wow.
Yeah. And it could be Christian, or it could be Muslim in another, culture, or whatever the main culture is.
Sure.
So that's what they talk about with Janus or Janus programming. It's the totally dual parts of themselves. So it's very highly sophisticated and intellectual. And you, on a counseling standpoint, have to be very familiar with this, because you don't know what part of them they're presenting and if they're legitimate or not.
Right. Yeah. And if they have ownership of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because some of them may have, what is it called? Coven loyalty. So they may be loyal to the coven as a witchcraft term or satanic kind of term, that they're loyal to their programmer in spite of being quote unquote free. So, and that's where I think a lot of the people that I've worked with that have been in the game for like decades, right? They're like, it is hard to find full healing earth side.
Sure.
It's really difficult. Does that mean we should not try or just totally give up? No, but I've seen incredible reward just with the work that I've been able to do with them. And so I think it's worthwhile to continue. Yeah.
I without a doubt. I mean, I would argue, I don't know that any of us fully heal, in this lifetime, in this, that's just, we're all on our journey. All of us, no matter how quote unquote perfect our childhood and, life idyllic may have seemed, everybody has incurred trauma. It has much more to do with how we respond to the circumstance. They've done these studies with twins, and both of them had the exact same experience, and one was traumatized by it, the other was not. So, a lot of it just has to do with our response to the experience. You can go through something really horrific and not be traumatized by it, surprisingly enough.
Yeah.
So it's not what was done to you, it's how you respond. But we all have that. And I think, we're all here on our path to learn, to grow, to heal in whatever ways we can. But as you said, I think that it's always a noble cause, I've heard people have this discussion about people who do come from the Christian worldview, and they say, well, in the end, God wins, and it's all, we have no control anyway, it's his plan. I've heard, I don't know if that's 100% accurate, but I've heard people who believe this, and so they take kind of this passive point of view. And for me, I don't know how you could, even if you knew you were going to lose, and I don't think that means we're going to lose. I'm just saying, but even if you knew you were going to lose, a noble cause is always worth fighting for. It is always worth seeking truth, even if you may never find it.
100%.
So that is part of our journey, right? We're supposed to do that, and that's goodness.
Yes, and I think what you were just talking about was like a Calvinistic worldview. So it's like within the umbrella of Christianity, there's so many different segments of worldviews.
And I'm just learning.
Yes,
I know very
but
little.
Calvinism is, there's 5 points of Calvin, and one of them is predestination.
Right.
And so, you've got more of a laissez-faire approach, whereas on maybe in another denomination or theology or non-denominational, you have people ready to fight and occupy until he comes back. So it's very, you have to know what type of doctrine and theology you're talking about there too. It's very interesting.
I mean, for me, I think that, regardless of any worldview, I think free will is kind of undeniable. And, yes, philosophically, people have argued it from a perspective that I think doesn't make sense because you have to be free from something. So, right. So I think we are endowed with free will. That's my worldview. But if we have free will, then we can change the course of things, even if there is a plan. And, we've seen throughout history that man has changed the course of things. So
100%. My family and I watched a documentary called Molly. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
Amazing story of one individual who single-handedly changed an entire portion of Africa. And it is just one of those, I was ugly crying, at the end, I'm just like, oh my gosh, it was one of those true stories where you see this one human who changed the trajectory of this entire portion of Africa's culture and landscape and the resources, and just amazing story. So highly recommend watching that if you want to be inspired to see what one human can
inspiration.
Do. It's so awesome.
Okay. Wow. Well, I will find it and I'll put the link.
Well, thank you so much. This has been awesome. If you have anything else that you want to impart us with, and of course, tell people where they can find you and all that good stuff.
Well, I just thank you so much for just having me and allowing me to express exactly what's going on in this field really of counseling, but especially SRA. And so, for me in particular, would covet the prayers of people. This is in my worldview, an experience of spiritual warfare.
I couldn't agree more.
And so definitely would want prayer. People could find me at Elysian Oaks Life Coaching. ElysianOaksLifeCoach.com is my website. And then I'm also, a counselor in the greater Nashville area. And then work with a slew of different anti-sex trafficking organizations as well. Again, they can get my single called The Great Awakening on iTunes if they want to as well. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I guess I'll leave you with one final question, because I kind of like to have a little bit of hope. What do you see kind of for the future? And I think this part of, there's so many facets of what's going on currently, but what you're dealing with in particular really exposes a very dark part of the plans and the actions that are being taken. So what are your thoughts on the future, and what are your thoughts for, I don't know, I call it the Great Awakening. I hope the Great Awakening will combat the Great Reset, but what do you say?
Well, there's never been such an unprecedented time. And with the pressure that is put on all of humanity right now, very uncomfortable pressure cooker type situation, we get to see what comes out of it. And I do, just like I stated in my song, they intended the great deception, but what they're getting is the Great Awakening. And what does that mean for humanity? That means coming together regardless of worldview, locking arms as humans, unplugging from this ridiculous machine, and caring for the needs of others. And I feel like in this time of crisis, and there's so much crisis, right, all around, we have the opportunity to really press in and look into the eyes of the person next to us and care and love beyond what we've been through, what we're all going through, and really love our neighbor, like you said. So for me, I see that we're going to occupy, but we have to come together, and we have to usurp and override these manufactured, prepackaged worldviews. And in order to do that, to really look at our neighbor and see a neighbor, not an enemy. So I do see that in the future. And I do see in the work that I do, no matter how hard it is, I'm seeing redemption. I'm seeing relationships being restored. I'm seeing healing. I could say, of course it's dark,
Yeah.
But man, when they come to the light, it is amazing. And it gives so much hope. It gives so much hope. Yeah.
And we need that. Humans need hope in order to try and fight, they need that.
Yeah.
And I mean the metaphorical fight, but in order to move forward, that's what we need. So
yeah.
thank you.